My spoiled daughter told her friends that she wants me dead rather than poor. But her reaction made me realize she deserved none of the fortune she expected. Stephanie grew up getting whatever she wanted the moment she wanted it, because I thought giving her everything would make her confident and successful. Private schools, ski trips, designer clothes, a new car at 16, another new car at 18 because the first one wasn't cool anymore. I paid for her Ivy League education, her apartment, her spring breaks in Cabo, her unpaid internships at fashion magazines, her startup that failed, her second startup that also failed. She never heard the word no, and I told myself I was setting her up for success. Meanwhile, her younger sister Ruby got a completely different childhood, not because I loved her less, but because I'd remarried and my second husband insisted on teaching financial responsibility. Ruby worked part-time jobs for spending money, wore regular clothes to public school, and drove a used car she bought with her own savings. She got scholarships for state college and worked nights at a restaurant to pay for books and supplies. I thought she was missing out on the advantages I was giving Stephanie, but Ruby never complained, just worked harder. When I called them both to announce my financial disaster, Stephanie's first response was, "Oh my God, Mom, this is so embarrassing. What will people think?" Ruby immediately asked if I was okay and how she could help. I told them I'd invested my retirement savings in a friend's business that turned out to be a scam, and I'd lost everything, including the house. Stephanie said, "Well, you can't stay with me. I only have a one-bedroom, and Brad wouldn't be comfortable with that." Brad was her boyfriend of 3 months who practically lived in the apartment I was still paying for. Ruby said she'd convert her home office into a bedroom for me immediately. Over the next few weeks, the differences became even more extreme. Stephanie called to complain about how my situation was affecting her. Her friends were asking questions, and it was humiliating. She actually asked me to tell people I was traveling instead of bankrupt, because it sounded better. She said she couldn't help financially because she had her lifestyle to maintain, but maybe Ruby could get a second job to support me since she was used to working anyway. Ruby was already working on solutions. She showed up with a budget spreadsheet calculating how we could manage expenses together. She'd researched social services I might qualify for, and made appointments for me. She brought groceries every week and cooked extra meals so I'd have leftovers. She even offered to sell her car and take the bus so we'd have emergency funds. The real test came when I told them the house was being foreclosed and I needed help moving. Stephanie said she had a spa weekend that had been planned for months and couldn't reschedule. When I said I'd lose everything if no one helped, she said maybe you should have thought about that before making risky investments at your age. She actually sent me links to homeless shelters saying they weren't that bad, and some even had private rooms. Meanwhile, Ruby took time off work that she couldn't afford to help me pack. She rented a truck with her credit card and enlisted her boyfriend to help load boxes. Stephanie texted that day asking if I could Venmo her $500 for her spa treatment, because her credit card was maxed out and she promised to pay me back when things got better. 3 months into my bankruptcy, I invited both daughters to dinner at Ruby's apartment where I'd been staying. Stephanie showed up 40 minutes late complaining about traffic, and immediately asked Ruby why she'd chosen such a cheap neighborhood. She spent the entire meal talking about her problems, how hard it was to find good help, how expensive her gym membership was, how Brad wanted to vacation in Europe, but she could only afford Mexico. Not once did she ask how I was managing or if I needed anything. Finally, I said I have something important to tell you both. I stood up and pulled out my bank statements. I'm not bankrupt. I never lost any money. I have $3 million in savings and investments plus 2 rental properties. This was all a test to see which of my daughters actually cared about me versus my money. Stephanie's mouth fell open and she started laughing, saying, "Oh, thank God, Mom, I knew something was off. You really had me worried for a minute there. Now you can pay me back for all the stress you caused and we can go shopping tomorrow to celebrate." I said, "I'm not done, Stephanie." I pulled out a folder and started reading from the messages she'd sent about me to her friends. "Your mother's bankruptcy is so embarrassing. I'm pretending she's dead rather than poor. Old people shouldn't gamble with money they can't afford to lose. If she ends up homeless, that's not my responsibility. Thank God I'm nothing like her." Ruby was crying and said, "Mom, how could you lie to me? I've been so worried about you." I said, "I know, sweetie, and I'm sorry, but I needed to know the truth about both of you." Then I turned to Stephanie. "Stephanie, you get exactly what you offered me when you thought I had nothing." "Nothing?" Stephanie stared at me for a long moment and then started laughing, but it sounded wrong, like she couldn't decide if this was real or some kind of joke. She kept looking between me and Ruby like one of us would break character and admit this was all part of some weird lesson I was teaching. Ruby wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and her voice came out shaky when she asked why I would put her through 3 months of worrying and crying and planning budgets if I didn't actually need help. I watched Stephanie's laugh fade into confusion, and then something harder as she processed what I'd just said. She opened her mouth and closed it twice before words came out asking if this was really happening right now. I turned to Ruby first because she deserved an explanation more than anyone. I told her I needed to know the truth about both my daughters before I made final decisions about my estate and who would get what when I died. I said I had to see who actually cared about me versus who just cared about my money. Stephanie cut me off before I could say more, and her voice went up an octave as she said this whole thing was insane, and I owed her an apology for the emotional distress I'd caused. She said I'd put her through hell for 3 months, making her worry about her mother being homeless. Then, without missing a beat, she asked when I was going to start her monthly allowance again, because she'd had to cut back on so many things and it had been really hard. I looked at Stephanie and said there would be no more allowance, no more rent payments for her apartment, no more funding for her lifestyle or her credit cards or her spa weekends or anything else. The color drained from her face and she went pale like I'd slapped her. She stood up so fast her chair scraped against Ruby's floor and said I couldn't just cut her off without any warning. She said she had expenses and commitments and a whole life built around my support. She started listing things like her gym membership and her car payment and her hair appointments. Like these were necessities I was being cruel to take away. Ruby spoke up quietly and asked if I was really going to punish Stephanie forever, or if this was another test within the test. I looked at Ruby and told her this was real and permanent and there were no more tests. I explained that Stephanie showed me exactly who she was when she thought I had nothing, and that person wasn't someone I wanted to keep enabling. Ruby's face did something complicated like she understood, but also felt sad about it because despite everything, Stephanie was still her sister. Stephanie's shock transformed into pure anger, and she started yelling that none of this was fair. She said I was the one who raised her to expect support, and now I was pulling the rug out from under her. Her phone buzzed on the table and she grabbed it and looked at the screen. Her face got tight and she typed something fast and aggressive with her thumbs. Then she threw the phone back down and demanded to know what I expected her to do now. She said she didn't have any real work experience because I'd always told her she didn't need it. She said I'd set her up to fail, and now I was abandoning her. I reached into my purse and pulled out an envelope I'd prepared before coming here. I handed it to Stephanie and told her it contained a check for $5,000. I explained this was her final payment from me, and it should be enough for 2 months' rent while she found a job and figured out her next steps. Stephanie ripped open the envelope and pulled out the check and stared at it like I'd handed her Monopoly money. She said $5,000 wouldn't even cover her credit card bills, let alone rent and food and everything else. She waved the check at me and her hand was shaking. Ruby stood up and asked if she could talk to me privately in her bedroom. I followed her down the short hallway and she closed the door behind us. We sat on her bed and she was quiet for a minute before she said she understood why I did this, but she was hurt I didn't trust her enough to tell her the truth. She said she spent 3 months absolutely terrified about my future. She said she'd laid awake at night trying to figure out how to make more money to support me. She said she'd even looked into getting a second job and had called her bank about taking out a personal loan. I apologized to Ruby and I meant it completely. I told her I was sorry for lying and for making her worry, but I had to make the test real or it wouldn't reveal the truth. I said if I'd told her it was fake, then her behavior wouldn't have been genuine, and I wouldn't have learned anything real about either of my daughters. Ruby nodded slowly and asked what happens now with Stephanie. She asked if I was really going to let her struggle, or if I'd give in when Stephanie came crying back to me in a few weeks. I told Ruby I was serious about the boundaries, and I wouldn't be changing my mind no matter how much Stephanie begged or threatened or manipulated. We walked back to the living room and found Stephanie pacing and talking on her phone in a loud, urgent voice. She was saying they needed to talk immediately, and something about how everything was falling apart. When she saw us come in, she ended the call fast and spun around to face me. She demanded to know about her trust fund and her inheritance. She said I couldn't take away what was legally hers, and she'd talk to a lawyer if she had to. Her face was red and her hands were clenched into fists at her sides. I told Stephanie there was no trust fund because I'd never set one up for her. I said my will currently left everything to Ruby with just a small token amount for Stephanie. I explained that after watching her behavior during these 3 months, I'd decided Ruby was the only daughter who deserved to inherit my estate. Stephanie's face went from red to almost purple, and she screamed that I was a mean old woman who was punishing her for being honest about her feelings. She said those messages to her friends were private, and I had no right to read them. She said everyone complains about their parents sometimes, and it didn't mean anything. Ruby set down her water glass and stood up from the couch. She looked at Stephanie and said the problem wasn't honesty or venting to friends. The problem was cruelty and selfishness and complete lack of care for another human being. Stephanie's face twisted and she spun toward her sister. She started yelling that Ruby had been playing the perfect daughter this whole time just to manipulate me. She said Ruby wanted to steal her inheritance and had been plotting this for months. She pointed her finger at Ruby and accused her of turning me against my own daughter. Ruby stayed calm and said she didn't need to plot anything because Stephanie's own actions revealed everything. Stephanie grabbed her purse off the arm of the chair. She was shaking and her voice got louder as she listed all the ways Ruby had supposedly sabotaged her over the years. I stood up and told them both to stop immediately. The room went quiet except for Stephanie's heavy breathing. I looked at Stephanie and said she had exactly 1 week to move all her belongings out of the apartment I'd been paying for. After 7 days, the locks would be changed and anything left behind would be donated to charity. Stephanie's mouth opened, but no sound came out at first. Then she started saying I couldn't do that because she had a lease and rights as a tenant. I pulled out my phone and showed her the lease agreement where I was listed as the primary leaseholder, and she was just an authorized occupant. I told her the property management company was already notified, and they'd be conducting a move-out inspection in 8 days. Stephanie grabbed her purse and yanked it onto her shoulder so hard the strap nearly broke. She stomped toward the door and slammed it behind her with enough force that a picture frame fell off Ruby's wall and the glass shattered on the floor. Ruby and I stood there looking at the broken frame for what felt like forever, but was probably only 2 or 3 minutes. Ruby bent down and started picking up the glass pieces carefully. She asked in a quiet voice if I was really okay with Stephanie hating me now. I knelt down to help her clean up and said Stephanie's hatred wasn't about losing a relationship with me. It was about losing access to money, and that proved the test had revealed the truth about who she really was. Ruby dropped a piece of glass into her palm and said she'd seen warning signs over the years. She said there were times when Stephanie said cruel things or acted entitled, but Ruby always made excuses because they were sisters and family was supposed to stick together. I told Ruby that family doesn't mean accepting abuse or enabling destructive behavior. We threw away the broken glass and Ruby got out her phone to order a new frame online. Over the next 3 days, my phone became a constant source of noise. Stephanie called me 47 times. I counted them. She also sent dozens of text messages that ranged from apologetic to threatening to manipulative. The first day she sent messages saying she was sorry and didn't mean the things she said to her friends. She claimed she was just stressed and venting, and everyone does that sometimes. The second day, the messages got angry. She said I was a terrible mother who set her up to fail and then punished her for it. She said I owed her support after raising her to expect it. The third day, she tried guilt and manipulation. She sent long paragraphs about how scared she was and how she didn't know what to do without my help. She said she might end up homeless and it would be my fault. I didn't answer any of the calls or texts, but I saved every single one in a folder on my phone in case I needed documentation later for legal reasons. Ruby came over to my house on the 4th day with her laptop. She said we needed to draft a formal letter to Stephanie outlining the new boundaries so everything was clear and in writing. We sat at my kitchen table and Ruby opened a document. She typed while I talked through what needed to be included. No financial support of any kind. No co-signing loans or credit cards. No emergency bailouts or last-minute money for rent or bills. No using my name or credit for anything. We made the language very clear and specific so there couldn't be any confusion or loopholes. Ruby printed 3 copies on professional letterhead. We drove to the post office together and sent 1 copy to Stephanie via certified mail with return receipt so there would be legal proof she received it. I kept 1 copy for my records and gave the 3rd copy to my lawyer. That night, I was back at Ruby's apartment having dinner when someone started pounding on the door at 11 o'clock. Ruby looked through the peephole and turned back to me with wide eyes. She whispered that it was Stephanie and she looked drunk. I could hear Stephanie's voice through the door begging to talk to me. She was crying and her words were slurred. Ruby pulled out her phone and called me even though I was standing right there. She put it on speaker so I could respond. I told Ruby to ask Stephanie to leave peacefully, and if she refused to call the police. Ruby opened the door just a crack with the chain still on. She told Stephanie she needed to go home and we could talk another time when everyone was calm. Stephanie tried to push the door open, but the chain held. She started yelling that I was inside and she knew it, and she just wanted 5 minutes to explain. Ruby closed the door and locked the deadbolt. She called the police non-emergency line and explained the situation. 2 officers arrived within 15 minutes. I watched through the peephole as they talked to Stephanie in the hallway. She was sitting on the floor with her back against the wall crying. One officer was a woman who crouched down next to Stephanie and spoke to her in a calm voice. After about 10 minutes, they convinced Stephanie to leave. The male officer knocked on Ruby's door and we let him in. He had kind eyes and asked if this was the first incident. I explained about the constant calls and texts and showed him my phone. He suggested I consider getting a restraining order if the harassment continued. He said it felt extreme, but sometimes it was necessary when family members couldn't respect boundaries. He gave me a card with a case number and said to call if Stephanie came back. The whole situation felt surreal, like something that happened to other people, not to me. The next morning, I called my lawyer and made an appointment to update my will. She had an opening that afternoon, so I drove to her office downtown. Her name was printed on a gold plaque outside a door on the 3rd floor. She invited me into a conference room with a long table and offered me coffee. I explained the situation with Stephanie and showed her the documented calls and texts and the police report number from last night. My lawyer nodded and said she'd handled family estate disputes before. She wasn't surprised by Stephanie's reaction at all. She said entitled adult children often responded this way when they finally faced financial consequences for their behavior. She pulled out forms for updating my will and we went through each section carefully. I made Ruby the primary beneficiary and executor. And I left Stephanie a token amount of $5,000 just so she couldn't claim she was accidentally forgotten. My lawyer explained this would make it much harder for Stephanie to contest the will later. We also discussed setting up a trust for Ruby that would provide support for major life events, but couldn't be accessed all at once. The whole meeting took almost 2 hours, and I felt exhausted when I left. That evening, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. It was Brad. His voice sounded awkward and uncomfortable. He said Stephanie had told him I cut her off financially, and he was wondering if there was anything he could do to help mediate the situation. He explained they couldn't afford the apartment without my support, and he wasn't sure what they were going to do. I felt a flash of anger that he had the nerve to call me about this. I told him this was between me and my daughters, and he needed to make his own choices about his relationship with Stephanie. He went quiet for a few seconds, and then admitted they had only been dating 4 months, and he wasn't sure he signed up for supporting someone who couldn't support herself. I said I understood his position, but I wasn't going to change my decision, and he should do what was right for him. He thanked me awkwardly and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, wondering how long it would take for Stephanie to realize Brad was about to leave her. 2 days later, Ruby showed me a text from Stephanie. Brad broke up with me and moved out, and this is all your fault, Mom. You destroyed my life. You took everything from me, and now I have nothing. I hope you're happy. Ruby looked worried and asked if I was okay. I read the message twice and felt a small twist of sympathy despite everything Stephanie had done. But I knew that giving in now would just teach her that throwing tantrums worked. I told Ruby that Stephanie needed to learn that actions have consequences, and enabling her would only make things worse. Ruby nodded, but I could see she was struggling with watching her sister fall apart. The next morning, I woke up to a Facebook message from someone named Jessica, who I vaguely remembered meeting at one of Stephanie's birthday parties years ago. She wrote that she heard rumors I had disowned my daughter over a misunderstanding, and wanted to know if it was true. The message had a concerned tone, but also felt like she was fishing for gossip. I didn't respond, but I had a sinking feeling about where this was coming from. I called Ruby and asked if she had seen anything on social media. She said no, but she would check. 20 minutes later, Ruby called back sounding upset. She had found a post from Stephanie on her public Facebook page. The post said I was abusive and withholding her inheritance illegally. It claimed I had always favored Ruby, and now I was punishing Stephanie for speaking her mind. The post already had dozens of comments from people saying how terrible I was and offering Stephanie sympathy and support. None of these people knew the real story about the test or the messages Stephanie had sent about wanting me dead, rather than poor. Ruby asked what I wanted to do about it. I told her I needed to call my lawyer. My lawyer answered on the third ring, and I explained the situation about Stephanie's social media posts. She listened carefully, and then told me to document everything, but not engage publicly. She said that Stephanie's false story could actually help my case if she ever tried to contest the will, because it showed a pattern of manipulation and dishonesty. I spent the next hour taking screenshots of every post and comment and saving them in a folder on my computer. I also went through my phone and took screenshots of all the text messages Stephanie had sent over the past few weeks. My lawyer said to keep a detailed record with dates and times in case we needed it later. 3 weeks passed, and I started to feel like maybe things were settling down. Then I got an email from Stephanie's apartment landlord asking about next month's rent. He said the payment was due in 5 days, and he hadn't received it yet. I wrote back explaining that I was no longer responsible for the lease and providing 30 days' notice as required by the rental agreement. I attached a copy of the lease showing I was listed as a guarantor, but had the right to cancel with proper notice. Then I forwarded the entire email chain to Stephanie so she couldn't claim she didn't know. I felt bad about it for maybe 10 minutes and then reminded myself that she was 28 years old and perfectly capable of figuring out how to pay rent. The next day, I received a long email from Stephanie. The subject line said we need to talk. The email claimed she had been applying for jobs every single day, but nobody would hire her because she didn't have recent work experience. She said it was my fault for not preparing her for the real world, and I had set her up to fail by giving her everything and then taking it all away. She wrote that I was a terrible mother who damaged her, and now she was suffering because of my mistakes. The email went on for 3 pages listing all the ways I had failed her and destroyed her future. I read it twice and felt my anger building with each paragraph. I opened a new email and typed one sentence. Ruby worked her way through college while you spent my money on spring breaks in Cabo. I hit send before I could second-guess myself. Then I blocked Stephanie's email address so I wouldn't have to see her response. 5 days went by and I didn't hear anything from her. Ruby said Stephanie hadn't contacted her either. Part of me wondered if my response had finally gotten through to her, but I knew it was more likely she was just regrouping for her next attack. Ruby came over for dinner on Saturday night and brought Chinese food from the place near her work. We were eating and talking about her upcoming promotion when she suddenly got quiet. She said Stephanie had called her that afternoon crying about having to move back in with friends and sell her designer clothes to pay for food. Ruby looked at me with sad eyes and said she was worried about her sister despite everything that had happened. I understood how she felt because Stephanie was my daughter and I was worried too. But I told Ruby that natural consequences were the only thing that might help Stephanie grow up. If we rescued her now, she would never learn to take care of herself. Ruby sighed and said she knew I was right, but it was hard to watch. The following Tuesday, I went to my first meeting of a support group for parents of estranged adult children. My therapist had recommended it weeks ago, but I kept putting it off because I felt embarrassed about the whole situation. The group met in a church basement with folding chairs arranged in a circle. There were 8 other parents there, ranging from their 40s to their 70s. A woman named Carol led the meeting and asked everyone to share their stories if they felt comfortable. I listened to other parents talk about their kids who had cut them off over money or relationships or old family conflicts. One father talked about his son who hadn't spoken to him in 5 years over a disagreement about religion. A mother cried while describing her daughter who blamed her for everything wrong in her life. Hearing their stories made me feel less alone and less guilty about enforcing boundaries with Stephanie. During the break, Carol told me that several parents in the group had eventually rebuilt relationships with their kids after the kids faced real consequences and grew up. She said it took time and consistency, but sometimes tough love was the only thing that worked. I drove home feeling lighter than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up to a notification on my phone showing Stephanie had posted on social media. I opened the app and saw photos of her apartment with boxes everywhere and captions about surviving betrayal and learning who your real family is. The comments were full of sympathy from people who had no idea what actually happened. I felt my anger building as I scrolled through her dramatic descriptions of being abandoned and abused, but I closed the app without responding or commenting. Ruby called me that afternoon and said she'd seen the post too, asking if I was okay. I told her I was fine and that Stephanie's public performance didn't change anything about the boundaries I'd set. 3 days later, I got a message request on social media from someone named Jennifer, who I recognized as one of Stephanie's college friends. The message was long and apologetic, explaining that she felt terrible about not reaching out sooner. She said several people in their friend group had been distancing themselves from Stephanie over the past few weeks because her constant complaining and victim stories were exhausting everyone. Jennifer wrote that Stephanie had been calling people at all hours crying about how unfair her life was and asking to borrow money that she never paid back. She said at first everyone felt sorry for Stephanie, but then they started comparing notes and realized she was telling different versions of the story to different people. Jennifer apologized for believing Stephanie's initial narrative without hearing my side and said she hoped I was doing well. I thanked her for reaching out but didn't share any details about the situation, just said I appreciated her honesty. 2 weeks after that, Ruby texted me asking if I was free for dinner because she had good news to share. We met at a small Italian place near her apartment, and she was practically glowing when I sat down. She told me she'd been promoted to assistant manager at the restaurant with a significant raise and more responsibility. I hugged her and told her how proud I was, and we ordered wine to celebrate. Over dinner, Ruby talked about how good it felt to earn the promotion through her own hard work and dedication. She said her boss had told her she was the most reliable employee they had, and several customers had specifically requested her section because of her service. Watching her face light up as she described her accomplishments made me realize I'd given her something far more valuable than anything I'd ever given Stephanie. Ruby had confidence that came from actual achievement instead of empty praise and unearned rewards. She had skills and work ethic that would carry her through life regardless of what happened with money or family. I felt a wave of gratitude that my second husband had insisted on teaching her financial responsibility, even when I thought it was too harsh. 2 months went by without any contact from Stephanie. I attended my support group meetings and focused on rebuilding my relationship with Ruby. Then one Tuesday, I found an envelope in my mailbox with no return address and handwriting I recognized as Stephanie's. My hands shook as I opened it and pulled out a single sheet of notebook paper. The note was short and written in blue pen. She said she'd gotten a job as a receptionist at a dental office and found a roommate situation she could afford with 2 other girls. She wrote that she was still angry about everything that happened and wasn't ready to talk yet, but she wanted me to know she was surviving. The letter had no greeting or closing, just the basic information and a date from the previous week. I read it 3 times trying to figure out how I felt about it. Part of me was relieved she'd found work and housing on her own. Another part was hurt by the coldness of the message and the continued anger. I brought the letter to my next therapy appointment and showed it to my therapist. She read it carefully and said it was actually a positive sign that Stephanie was taking steps toward independence, even if she was still processing her feelings. My therapist suggested I send a brief response acknowledging her progress without offering money or advice, keeping the door open for future communication without pushing. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a blank card and tried to figure out what to say. I didn't want to sound preachy or condescending. but I also didn't want to pretend everything was fine between us. Finally, I wrote that I was proud she'd found a job and housing, that I loved her, and I was here whenever she was ready to have an honest conversation about our relationship. I mailed the card the next day and tried not to expect anything back. Weeks passed and I didn't hear from Stephanie, which didn't surprise me but still stung a little. Ruby and I started having dinner together every Thursday night, alternating between her place and mine. Without Stephanie's drama hanging over us, we could actually talk about our lives and rebuild our relationship. One night at her apartment, Ruby brought up something she'd never mentioned before. She said it was really hard growing up watching Stephanie get everything she wanted while being told she needed to learn responsibility and earn things herself. I put down my fork and listened as she explained how she used to wonder what was wrong with her, that I treated them so differently. Ruby said she knew logically that her stepfather influenced how I raised her, but emotionally she always felt like she wasn't good enough or lovable enough to deserve the same treatment as her sister. Her voice cracked as she talked about watching Stephanie get a new car while she saved for months to buy her used one. I felt tears running down my face as I listened to how much pain I'd caused her. When she finished talking, I apologized for the inequality in how I raised them. I explained that I thought I was helping Stephanie by giving her everything, but I actually hurt both my daughters in different ways. I told Ruby that watching her earn her promotion and build her life made me realize I'd given her the better gift, even though it didn't feel that way at the time. Ruby started crying and said she spent years feeling like she wasn't good enough because I didn't treat her the same way as Stephanie. We sat there crying together, and I held her hand while apologizing over and over for making her feel less than. After we calmed down, Ruby said she understood my intentions were good, even if the execution was flawed, and she was grateful we could talk about it honestly now. The next weekend, my second husband asked if we could take a walk together. We went to the park near our house and walked the loop trail while he told me he was proud of how I'd handled the situation with Stephanie, even though it was painful. He admitted he'd wanted to intervene many times over the years when he saw how I was raising her, but he respected that Stephanie was my daughter and my decision to make. He said watching Stephanie's entitlement grow had been frustrating because he could see where it was leading, but felt powerless to change it. I thanked him for respecting my role as Stephanie's mother, even when he disagreed with my choices. He squeezed my hand and said he was glad Ruby had turned out so well, and that maybe now Stephanie had a chance to grow up too. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, and I felt grateful for his support and patience through all of this. 4 months after the revelation dinner, Ruby called me sounding upset. She said Stephanie had texted her asking if I was serious about the will changes or if it was just meant to scare her into behaving better. Ruby wanted to know how to respond without making things worse. I told her to be honest and direct, that Stephanie needed to understand her choices had real consequences that weren't going away. Ruby texted back telling Stephanie that I was completely serious about the will, and she needed to accept that her actions during the fake bankruptcy showed her true priorities. Stephanie didn't respond to Ruby's message, and Ruby said she felt relieved to finally be honest with her sister, instead of trying to protect her feelings. Stephanie's reply came through Ruby's phone 2 hours later, and Ruby showed me the screen with her hand shaking. The message called Ruby a goody two-shoes, who always sucked up to get attention, and said Ruby manipulated me during a vulnerable time. Ruby read it twice, then blocked Stephanie's number right there in front of me. She said she was done being Stephanie's emotional punching bag, and I told her I fully supported that decision. We sat together quietly for a few minutes, and I felt relieved that Ruby was finally setting boundaries with her sister. The next week, I scheduled a meeting with a financial advisor to discuss setting up a trust for Ruby. I drove to his office downtown and explained I wanted to create something that would support Ruby for major life events like buying a house or starting a business. He suggested structuring it so she couldn't access everything at once, which made sense to me. We spent 2 hours going through different options, and I signed papers to establish a trust worth $800,000. Ruby didn't know about it yet, and I planned to tell her when the timing felt right. The advisor said it would take about 3 weeks to finalize all the paperwork, and I left his office feeling good about providing real support for Ruby's future. My rental property on the east side started having plumbing problems, and the tenant called saying water was leaking through the ceiling. I drove over to inspect the damage and found mold growing behind the bathroom wall. The contractor I called estimated repairs would cost $40,000, and I seriously considered just selling the place instead. Ruby came with me to the second inspection and took notes on everything the contractor said. She researched 3 other contractors online and called them all to get competing quotes. Over the next week, she managed the whole project for me, getting estimates and checking references and negotiating prices. She got the cost down to $32,000 and found a contractor who could start immediately. Watching her handle everything reminded me exactly why I did the fake bankruptcy test in the first place. Ruby called me one afternoon sounding surprised and told me she'd just seen Stephanie outside the dental office where Stephanie worked. The office was only 2 blocks from Ruby's restaurant, and they'd run into each other on the sidewalk. Ruby said Stephanie looked tired and had lost weight, but she didn't cause any drama or start yelling. Stephanie just nodded at Ruby and walked away quickly without saying anything. Ruby asked if I thought Stephanie was doing okay, and I said I honestly didn't know, but Stephanie needed to figure things out on her own. 6 months after I cut Stephanie off completely, a Facebook notification popped up on my phone. Stephanie had sent me a friend request, which surprised me because she'd been completely silent for weeks. I stared at my phone for a long time, trying to figure out what it meant. Part of me wondered if she wanted something or if this was a genuine attempt to reconnect. I accepted the request but didn't send her any message, deciding to let her make the next move if she was really ready to talk. My second husband asked what I was going to do, and I told him I was just going to wait and see what happened. A few days later, Stephanie posted photos from a weekend camping trip with some friends I didn't recognize. She looked genuinely happy in the pictures, wearing regular jeans and a plain t-shirt without any designer labels. The photos showed her roasting marshmallows and hiking on a trail and sitting around a campfire. I scrolled through her recent posts and noticed she wasn't complaining about anything or posting victim narratives anymore. Every post from the last month showed her doing normal activities and looking content. I didn't comment on any of the photos, but I saved a few to my phone because she looked more like herself than she had in years. Ruby came over for dinner and showed me a letter she'd received from her restaurant chain. They'd accepted her into a management training program that could lead to running her own location within 2 years. She was excited but worried about the cost of training materials and books. I offered to help pay for anything she needed, and she accepted the offer gracefully. She understood this was support for an earned opportunity, and not just me handing her money for nothing. We spent the evening looking at the program requirements, and I felt proud watching her plan out her future with such focus and determination. 3 weeks later, I opened my email and found a message from Stephanie with the subject line, "Can we talk?" My hands started shaking as I clicked it open and read the short message asking if we could meet for coffee. I read it 3 times, trying to figure out if there was some hidden meaning or manipulation. The message was simple and direct without any drama or guilt trips. I sat with it for an hour before responding that yes, we could meet, and I suggested a coffee shop halfway between our locations. She replied within minutes, agreeing to meet there on Saturday morning. Saturday came and I arrived at the coffee shop 15 minutes early, too nervous to be late. Stephanie walked in right on time, wearing normal jeans and a sweater with minimal makeup. She looked different somehow, less polished but more real. She sat down across from me and her hands were shaking a little as she wrapped them around her coffee cup. She started by saying she wasn't there to ask for money and just wanted to talk, which was more mature than I expected from her. I nodded and waited for her to continue, watching her face carefully for signs of manipulation. Stephanie took a deep breath and apologized for the things she'd said when she thought I was bankrupt. She admitted she'd been shallow and cruel and said she was ashamed of how she'd acted. She explained that losing everything forced her to realize how empty her life had been when it was just about money and status. Her voice cracked a little when she talked about the messages she'd sent to her friends about me. She said working at the dental office and living with a roommate taught her things she should have learned years ago. I listened without interrupting and watched tears form in her eyes as she talked about how wrong she'd been. I thanked her for coming and told her I was proud she found a job and a place to live without my help. She wiped her eyes with a napkin and said the last 6 months were the hardest thing she'd ever been through, but she learned more about herself than she wanted to know. She admitted she'd been horrible to me and to Ruby, and didn't realize how empty her life was until everything got taken away. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand, because even though she'd hurt me deeply, I could see she was trying to change. We ended up talking for almost 2 hours about her new life at the dental office and her roommate who worked 2 jobs to support her kid. Stephanie told me about learning to clip coupons and cook actual meals instead of ordering takeout every night. She said her roommate taught her how to make a grocery list and stick to a budget, which sounded basic but was completely new to her. When she mentioned Ruby, her voice got quieter and she asked how her sister was doing. I told her Ruby was doing great, and Stephanie nodded slowly and said she knew she didn't deserve forgiveness, but she wanted Ruby to know she was sorry. She talked about specific things she'd said and done over the years that she felt ashamed of now. I didn't offer her money or promise to change my will, but I did tell her I loved her and wanted to rebuild our relationship if she kept making good choices. She said she understood that trust had to be earned back, and she didn't expect me to just forget everything that happened. When we left the coffee shop, she hugged me tight and thanked me for giving her a chance to apologize. I drove home feeling cautiously hopeful, but also aware that one conversation didn't erase years of entitled behavior. I called Ruby that evening to tell her about the meeting. She listened quietly while I described Stephanie's apology and the changes she seemed to be making. Ruby said she was glad Stephanie was doing better, but she needed more time before she could think about reconnecting with her sister. I told her I completely understood and would never pressure her to forgive Stephanie before she was ready. Ruby admitted she'd been angry at Stephanie for so long that she didn't know if they could ever have a real relationship. I reminded her that she didn't have to decide anything right now and could take all the time she needed. We talked about her restaurant job and the management program she was starting next month. She sounded excited about learning the business side of running a restaurant and said her boss thought she had real potential. Before we hung up, she asked me to let her know if Stephanie kept improving or if it turned out to be an act. I promised I would and told her how proud I was of the person she'd become. Stephanie and I started meeting for coffee every few weeks after that first conversation. She told me about her coworkers at the dental office and how weird it felt to actually earn a paycheck instead of just spending money I gave her. She described learning to cook simple meals and feeling proud when she made it through a whole week on her grocery budget. One time she showed me a recipe she'd found online for cheap chicken dinners and said her roommate's daughter loved it. She talked about taking the bus to work and how different her life looked compared to a year ago. The changes weren't dramatic or perfect, but they seemed real and steady. She stopped complaining about not having designer clothes or expensive vacations. Instead, she told me about small victories like paying her rent on time or saving $50 from her paycheck. I watched her carefully during these meetings, looking for signs that she was manipulating me or building up to asking for money. But she never asked for anything except my time and attention. She seemed genuinely interested in rebuilding our relationship without the financial component that had defined it before. 3 months into our regular coffee meetings, Stephanie asked if she could apologize to Ruby in person. I told her that decision was between her and her sister, but I would let Ruby know she wanted to talk. Ruby took a week to think about it before agreeing to meet for lunch with me there as a buffer. We met at a casual restaurant halfway between their places on a Saturday afternoon. Stephanie arrived early and sat nervously checking her phone until Ruby walked in. The first few minutes were awkward with everyone studying their menus and making small talk about the weather. Then Stephanie put her menu down and said she wanted to apologize for everything she'd done and said over the years. She didn't make excuses or try to minimize her behavior. She specifically mentioned the messages she'd sent during the fake bankruptcy and the cruel comments she'd made about Ruby always working. She told Ruby she was jealous of her sister's independence and work ethic, but expressed it through meanness instead of admiration. Ruby listened without interrupting, and I could see her processing everything Stephanie said. When Stephanie finished, Ruby was quiet for a minute before responding. She said she appreciated the apology, but needed Stephanie to understand how much damage had been done over the years. Ruby told her sister that she'd spent their whole childhood feeling like she wasn't good enough because I treated them so differently. She admitted she'd resented Stephanie for getting everything handed to her while she had to work for basic things. Then she said she was willing to work toward rebuilding their relationship, but it would take time and consistent changed behavior from Stephanie. She made it clear she wasn't going to forget years of cruelty just because Stephanie apologized once. Stephanie nodded and said she understood that trust took time to rebuild. She didn't argue or get defensive or try to rush Ruby into forgiveness. She just accepted the boundary Ruby set and said she'd prove through her actions that she was different now. I sat there watching my daughters have an honest conversation for maybe the first time in their lives. It wasn't perfect or easy, but it felt real in a way their relationship never had before. A year after the revelation dinner at Ruby's apartment, Stephanie called me with exciting news. She'd been promoted to the office manager at the dental practice where she worked. Her voice was full of genuine pride as she described the new responsibilities and the raise that came with the promotion. She told me she'd been taking online business courses at night to improve her skills, and her boss noticed the effort. She said she never thought she'd care about a job or feel proud of earning something through her own work. I congratulated her and told her how impressed I was with everything she'd accomplished. She mentioned she was saving money to take a real vacation next year, something she'd pay for herself instead of expecting me to fund it. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hand, thinking about how much she'd changed in 12 months. I made an appointment with my lawyer the following week to update my will. I'd been thinking about this decision for months and finally felt ready to make it official. I told my lawyer I wanted to leave Stephanie a modest inheritance, significantly less than Ruby would receive, but enough to show I believed in her growth. My lawyer suggested structuring it so Stephanie would only receive the money if she maintained employment and financial independence for 5 consecutive years after my death. That way, if she fell back into old patterns, she wouldn't get the inheritance, but if she continued growing, she'd be rewarded for her effort. I agreed with the structure because it protected my intentions while giving Stephanie something to work toward. The amount I designated for her was enough to help with a down payment on a house or starting a small business, but not enough to stop working and live off. Ruby's inheritance remained substantially larger because she'd proven herself over many years and had never needed consequences to develop good character. I signed the updated will feeling like I'd found the right balance between acknowledging Stephanie's progress and rewarding Ruby's consistent integrity. Ruby called me 6 months later with news that she'd been approved for a business loan to open her own restaurant. Her voice shook with excitement as she explained the location she'd found and the menu concept she'd developed based on the comfort food she'd been cooking for years. I asked her to send me the business plan and loan details because I wanted to help with startup costs as a gift, not a loan. She tried to refuse, at first saying she could manage on her own, but I insisted that supporting her dream was different from enabling entitlement. We settled on an amount that covered kitchen equipment and initial inventory while she handled rent and staffing from the loan. The next 4 months flew by as Ruby transformed an empty space into a cozy neighborhood restaurant. I helped paint walls and assemble furniture alongside her boyfriend and a few friends she'd hired as staff. Stephanie texted Ruby asking about the opening date and whether she could help with anything, which surprised both of us. Ruby cautiously invited her to the soft opening, and Stephanie showed up on time carrying a huge bouquet of flowers and a card congratulating her sister. She didn't ask for special treatment or complain about the location or make the moment about herself. Instead, she helped set tables and chatted with customers and genuinely celebrated Ruby's accomplishment without any trace of jealousy or resentment. I stood near the kitchen watching my daughters work together for the first time in years. They laughed about a mishap with a food order, and Stephanie complimented Ruby's cooking with real admiration in her voice. The moment felt fragile, like something that could shatter if I breathed too hard, but it was real in a way their relationship had never been before. They weren't playing roles or competing for my attention or measuring themselves against each other. They were just two sisters supporting each other because they wanted to, not because they had to. After the dinner rush died down, Stephanie pulled me aside near the back hallway. She said she needed to tell me something, and her hands twisted nervously around her purse strap. I braced myself for a request for money or a complaint, but instead she thanked me for doing the test, even though it was brutal and humiliating. She admitted she'd been becoming someone she didn't like and didn't know how to stop until I forced her to face reality. She mentioned she'd been dating someone new for 3 months who worked in construction and didn't care about designer labels or expensive restaurants. She said it felt good to be valued for who she was, rather than what she could spend, and she finally understood why Ruby had always seemed more content, despite having less. I hugged her and told her I was proud of how far she'd come, and that growth was never easy, but always worth it. 2 years after the revelation dinner at Ruby's apartment, both my daughters were thriving in ways that felt authentic and earned, rather than handed to them. Ruby's restaurant had become a neighborhood favorite with a waiting list on weekends, and she'd hired 3 additional staff members. Stephanie managed the dental office where she worked and was finishing her business degree online, taking classes at night after long shifts. We started having Sunday dinners together every month, rotating between Ruby's restaurant when it was closed and my house, and occasionally Stephanie's modest apartment. The conversations flowed easily with laughter and genuine interest in each other's lives, rather than the tense silences and competitive updates from before. Ruby shared stories about difficult customers and new menu items, while Stephanie talked about her classes and her boyfriend's construction projects. I watched them tease each other affectionately and offer advice without judgment, and make plans to see each other outside our monthly dinners. The relationships we'd built felt real and solid, based on honesty and genuine care, rather than money and obligation. I finally had what I'd always wanted, which was 2 daughters who knew how to stand on their own feet, and who chose to stay in my life because they loved me, not because they needed my bank account.